Hello. It's hit return. It should, yeah, okay. So about 8 months ago, the World Economic Forum published an article entitled "The COVID-19 Pandemic Has Changed Education Forever." Another headline, this one from Inside Higher Education, is called "The Shift to Remote Learning, the Human Element." With the subtitle, "Experts Weigh In on How the Sudden Forced Adoption of Technology-Delivered Instruction Will Affect the Well-Being of Professors and Students Alike." Around the same time, a headline in Canada's Globe and Mail said, "The education world has been turned upside down. Online learning may reshape the classroom." Well, these headlines seem rather alarmist and dramatic, but hyperbolic language aside, they are signaling something we all need to pay attention to: a radical change in education. I've been teaching online nonstop since April 2020, so that's about 10 months. I really resisted the shift until I began to see that e-learning can still be productive for both teachers and students, especially under the circumstances. There were difficulties for me, but before I discuss those and some suggested solutions, I want to elaborate a little bit on the problem of resisting technology. Just as we get used to one new method, another one comes along. So like we had Zoom and WebEx, and you can see the problems inherent in that. There's no turning back. So we're on a highway, but it's a peculiar highway that has only one lane. It's not a two-way street, where it's only one direction, and that is forward, and the destination is just somewhere ahead. We don't really know. Anyway, in light of this, as we move to the next slide, here's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, the first thing, technological innovation and resistance, is not my main point. However, I will start my talk by grounding it in this thing because it's relevant to the whole picture of online learning. I'll discuss some famous resistors to major technological innovations throughout history. Why would I do that? Because it illustrates the futility of resisting advancement. In the rest of the presentation, I will briefly discuss some of the ambiguous terminology we've come up with over this course of e-learning. And after that, I'll present some observation based on second language acquisition theory, SLA theory, and talk about some outstanding common problems and solutions that tend to come up in online, especially for students. Finally, we'll see how certain interactive strategies can help resolve these issues. And there's a bit of an overlap, actually quite a bit of overlap with Kelly's presentation about community and how to get around that thing. Okay, move on. Changes such as we're going through now can be called a paradigm shift, which is defined as a fundamental change in the basic concepts and practices of a discipline. Paradigm shift is also used to describe any profound or monumental change in an original model. So it is safe to say that we are in the midst of one now. Humanity has faced many paradigm shifts in relation to communications in particular. I recently read a book called The Influencing Machine by Brooke Gladstone. It's a fascinating book, and in it she argues that resistance to the development of technology is essentially like resisting our own future. She gives us examples to demonstrate that technologies we now consider harmless, TV, radio, the printed word, and even handwriting, were once considered new and threatening to the old ways. Please move on. So in the face of new technologies, many people are Luddites, that is to say, those who resist innovation. We might call them also naysayers. History has an interesting way of narrating its own stories. So to set the context here, I will open with a timeline of historical events that highlight how futile it is for us to resist innovation. In each case, the new technology being introduced is directly related to teaching in one way or another, because they're all in the field of communication. Please move on. The first example is from a play called Phaedrus, written by Plato in 350 BC. In the story, an Egyptian god named Theuth came to the king Thamos to tell him that he had discovered the art of writing. King Thamos, our first naysayer, replied, "Writing will introduce forgetfulness into the soul. They will not practice using their memory because they will put their trust in writing. Your invention will enable them to hear many things, while for the most part, they will know nothing." Well, if you just walk into a library or browse the internet, you will know which argument prevailed. That frightening new technology of writing, in spite of the negative aspects pointed out by the king, has proven to be our main method of preserving culture and knowledge and wisdom for thousands of years of human civilization. Move on. Jumping ahead to 1545, Dutch philosopher and scholar, also called the Prince of Humanists, Erasmus, wrote to resist a recent innovation called printing. Though he eventually came around to support it, he was at first scandalized by the business of printing. He called those engaged in it rascally printers and decried the swarms of new books, arguing that the very multitude of them is indeed harmful to scholarship. Even if they offered something worth knowing, the very mass of them would be serious impediment to learning. Move on. So moving ahead here a few hundred years again to the 1960s at the advent of television, we have another example of a groundbreaking technology, television, which changed our world basically. Just as it was becoming popular, the chairman of the US Federal Communications Bureau, his name was Newton Minow, in the early 60s famously said, "Sit down in front of your TV, keep your eyes glued to the set until the station signs off, and what you will observe is a vast wasteland." Move on, please. Slide 10. But before television, there was also radio, which was criticized. In 1936, an issue of Gramophone magazine asserted that, quote, "Children often lie awake in bed, restless and fearful, or wake up screaming as a result of nightmares brought on by stories that they would listen to on the radio." Next. In a rather famous book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Douglas Adams suggested rather humorously that anything that is in the world when you're born is normal and ordinary. Anything that's invented when you're between the age of 35 is new. Anything invented after you're 35 is against the natural order. In other words, as we become accustomed to one way of doing things, the more difficult it is to accept a strange new method. Next slide. In defense of innovation, Henry Ford said that if he had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Instead, he gave them something they could not have imagined, something really outside the box, outside of existing ideas of what was possible. Similarly, we did not see this virtual mode of education coming. It was, sorry, back to that other slide, the Henry Ford slide. Yeah. Similarly, we did not see this virtual mode of education coming. It was once just a tool, perhaps an instrument we'd use from time to time in our classes, but now it is our major platform for educating students. Something we previously could not have imagined has become the norm. Next slide. So all of that is to say that we should embrace this paradigm shift brought on by the pandemic. There is no turning back. As Susan Loeb, professor of education at Brown University, writes, quote, "Virtual courses are allowing students to access lessons and exercises and interact with teachers in ways that would have been impossible if an epidemic had closed schools even a decade or two ago." So we may be skeptical of online learning, but it is time to embrace and improve it. Okay, so that raises the question, how do we do that? How do we improve it? How do we embrace it? Before moving on to answer those questions, let's first decide what we mean by online learning or remote learning. Next slide. So in the attempt to simplify this question of terminology, many institutions have offered their own definitions. And so doing, we've created a surfeit of terms, which at this point might be good to sort out so we have a common understanding going forward. What is on, so next slide, please. So what is online learning? What is remote learning, e-learning, distance learning, and is there a difference? Next slide, please. A professional studies blog at Drexel University said millions of college students have now found themselves with little notice at home in their pajamas, sitting behind a computer, trying to finish their courses. I'm very familiar with this because that's my daughter sitting there, 15-year-old in high school, exactly as they say, in her pajamas at home in bed, doing school. So this experience is not online learning. This is called remote learning, and yes, there is a difference. Next slide, please. So a very simplified explanation would be remote learning has more accountability, but requires scheduled class times. In other words, a teacher shows up, the students show up, and there's a synchronous interaction. Online learning has more flexibility, but requires learners to be self-motivated and self-directed and so on. Both provide the many benefits of learning at home, more comfortable, more relaxed, and so on, removing the commute to school, providing a measure of flexibility. But of course, these are very general definitions. And in the next slide, we raise the question of definitions from another perspective in an article called E-Learning, Online Learning, and Distance Learning Environments, Are They the Same? Our colleagues in 2010 looked at the question from an academic perspective and found that differences in terminology were dictated by the learning environment in which teaching is taking place. As a result, they state it has been difficult to do, quote, meaningful cross-study comparisons, resulting in a lack of agreement on common definitions. They include that lack of consistency in terminology inevitably affects not only the researchers, but also the course designers. Well, if it affects course designers, by extension, it's affecting students and teachers and administration. Admittedly, that paper was written in 2010, and in the 10 years since then, many innovations and additions have been developed, both technologically and pedagogically. So the result is that we now have a plethora of terms, some clearly defined, some not. The next slide, please. Sorry. So, with the rapid proliferation of online courses in 2018, the European Association for Quality Assurance in Higher Education decided to try and peg the definitions. They write, the definition of e-learning may differ from country to country, so in order to share a common understanding, it is necessary to clarify e-learning terms. And then they add a caveat, kind of a warning that you see in the box there. It is important to note that e-learning is a very dynamic and innovative field of learning. Definitions are frequently revised and adapted to reflect the new reality. Okay, so next slide, please. Professor Neil Curry, he's a researcher in academic English at Coventry University in the UK, calls what we have been talking about by yet another name, digital pedagogy, which he sees as an all-embracing term for the various modes of online teaching. He writes, quote, digital pedagogy is so new that there's not much impartial research on it. And with that, it can be hard to know what we should do and what can guide us. But to summarize this bit here on terminology, if I take a step back from this range of terms, and for the purpose of the presentation, I thought the term e-learning seems broad enough to encompass all others, at least for the present, for this presentation. Okay, move on, please. So some things to consider about technology in EAP. So according to Curry, the last quote we had, we should, no, sorry, stay on that title slide. Yeah. We should look to research in second language acquisition theory, which he suggests, quote, can guide us towards a better understanding of how to use technology. In these extraordinary times, however, we are fully dependent on delivering classes through technology. We do not have a choice at the moment. So it's important that we learn to use technology in the very best possible way. Next slide, please. Curry writes, quote, technology will not automatically improve the quality of learning. And while research on digital pedagogy is rather thin on the ground, we can borrow from research in SLA, second language acquisition, which will guide us toward understanding not only how, but when and why to use technology, unquote. In his attempts to implement digital pedagogy, Curry turned to the research of Scott Thornbury, a well-known expert in the field of English language studies who has written voluminously on all things ELT. Also a UK-based, but now he's with the New School University in New York. Thornbury recommends that any aid to language learning should be assessed by its fitness for purpose, which means, quote, how well does it facilitate learning? He goes on to suggest that such innovations be measured by the findings of research in second language acquisition. In language. So if we use that as a guide, it kind of helps us to choose the right things in how we implement technology. Thornbury goes on to suggest that such innovations be measured by the findings. Oh, sorry, I said that already. At which point he referred to prominent researchers to find out what they had to say. So he went to the literature, he dug it up, all the prominent SLA people, and dug up their kind of their theories and hypotheses and sort of constructed a set of observations. These observations ideally could guide our methods, and we will get into those in the next slide. Not yet, though. Curry suggests that our approach should be principled, which can be achieved by looking at frameworks such as Thornbury's, again, based and grounded on second language acquisition theory. Next slide, please. Okay, having said that, observations in an abridged form. Now, I put all this in gray so that you wouldn't be distracted by it, but just to direct your attention to the red one there, which says, learners learn from each other during communicative interaction. Okay, so that's also very much what Kelly was talking about, the communicative interaction. So in 2018, based on these observations by Thornbury, which were somewhat, as you can see, technical and abstract, Curry composed some user-friendly questions to help teachers like you and me to facilitate a kind of best practice for the use of technology. Next slide. Next slide, please. So here's Curry's on Thornbury's observations. Now, each of Curry's questions is based on an observation. And I draw your attention to the one in red, which is titled Interaction. Can learners interact and work together? This is like a criteria that must be present when we use technology. This question leads us again to the key word interaction and the logical conclusion that interaction among peers fosters a sense of community. Okay, move on. So you can press the enter again, so another thing's going to come up. Yeah, okay. As I read up on the importance of interaction in language learning in the online context, I kept coming upon this term student isolation. It came up repeatedly. For example, There was a clinical study of mental health indicators among undergraduates in Switzerland, published just 6 months ago in 2020. And it showed that isolation caused by this shift to remote learning generated increased levels of depression, anxiety, stress, and loneliness among students. As we saw in both Thornberry and Curry's work, it is clear that interaction is a necessary and fundamental element, and the lack of it leads to isolation. So you can see here on those, so they look like piano keys, but it's actually, notice that each one is going up. The first one on the left of each column is in 2019, and on the right, the extreme right, each of those is 2020. So you can see each of those has increased. So isolation, this term isolation, was frequently highlighted by other researchers as well. And so from here, I will discuss it in more detail. If you can move on to the next slide. Next slide, okay. So e-learning problems and solutions. So we've been able to identify the problem here is isolation, a lack of interaction, which leads to what I'm going to talk about next, is some solutions. So though we enthusiastically embrace online teaching, it is clear that there are problems inherent in it. The most salient problem, which we've just been talking about, seems to be that of student isolation. But there is in effect a solution as well, which is frequently recommended in the literature, and that is the building sense of community. So a sense of community, community of practice, collaboration, I'm taking them to mean the same thing, although maybe technically they have some nuanced differences. For this presentation, they don't have a difference. So in the next slide, 27, again, I just draw your attention to the part in red. So this is in an article called "The Disadvantages of E-Learning," written in 2019. Excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of water. This is written by Samper Tam, a Finnish researcher in the phenomenon of e-learning. And he listed some common problems with online course delivery that he says are plaguing the industry, and that's a quote. One of the main problems he mentions is that of social isolation. He offers solutions based on, you guessed it, interaction and a sense of community, the same issues that both Thornberry and Curry and the Swiss study alluded to. So out of Tam's list of problems here, the issue that correlates with building community is that e-learning can cause social isolation. So let's unpack that and look at the suggested solutions. Next slide. So in e-learning, the methods currently practiced tend to make participating students, quote, contemplation, remoteness, and a lack of interaction. As a result, many students and teachers are spending much of their time online and can start experiencing signs of social isolation. Students talked a lot about really missing being in person with their classmates, with their colleagues, with faculty members, having those spontaneous, organic conversations and relationships. They miss the ones they make in the context of their college education specifically, because not only does it make them excited about learning and hold them accountable and motivate them to stay engaged, but they also actually learn a lot more. So according to Tam, some of the ways to combat this social isolation and loneliness among students is breakout group activities during class, collaborative research projects over a longer period, and monitoring the students for signs of social isolation. As teachers, we kind of had a shepherding heart, a nurturing heart, where we can sort of look at our students and we can just look at them, we know who's struggling and who's not. Although online, that is a bit more difficult, right? Which touches on another problem that I'm going to talk about at the end. Okay, so next slide, please. here, let's collect our thoughts, okay, in order to move forward. So I think we've established that interaction is the key word here in these different citations. We see Thornberry talked about communicative interaction, and Curry talks about creating community, interacting, working together, and Tam writes that increased interaction between online students is a solution. But this quote really struck me from Arkurful and Abaidu, and it says, the most frequent condemnation of e-learning is the complete absence of vital personal interactions, not only between learners and instructors, but also among colleague learners, among peer learners. Next slide, please. So, and hit the thing to make the other, something come up. Yeah, okay. So as educators, we're quite familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. And the graphic here shows that if we want our students to develop higher order cognitive skills, then we need to promote interactive collaborative tasks. So you can hit enter one more time and a little arrow is going to come down. There you go. Okay. So as you see here on the left side, only lower order skills, knowledge and understanding, like what we might call retrieving and remembering, the lower order skills, only those are achievable without an interactive aspect in the class. Higher order skills of application, analysis, evaluation, and creation come with carrying out tasks in a social context, which to my mind means interaction among peers in a collaborative setting. The same point is mentioned in other research, which I will discuss in a moment. But to summarize, language acquisition research shows that interaction supports, quote, a sense of community, which is essential to effective learning. So having identified this line of inquiry, let's go on to examine some practical ways to develop the sense of community in the context of e-learning. The literature frequently endorses two practical methods in particular, and these are blogging and near-peer role models, NPRMs. Stay there, Belela. No, stay on that slide, yeah. So with teachers and researchers separated, teachers and students separated, creating and maintaining a sense of community relies on some of the same principles we use in the actual classroom. Many teachers see learning not just as a cognitive process, but a social one as well. And so that also goes back to Kelly's presentation and what Bell Hooks said about the social aspect is extremely important. And so they try to develop the sense of a shared experience, which is linked to solving this problem of isolation. Okay, go on, please. So in my this secondary research I was doing, I came upon this very interesting professor in educational technology. He's Greek and his name is Panos Siozos. And he writes, quote, premium quality education comes from an environment that nurtures interaction, where instructors such as you and me and all of us we are nurturing a community, and students learn through multi-layered networking and interactivity. Learning does not happen in a vacuum, but rather within an interconnected social network. So to reiterate, putting together Thornberry's, Curry's, and Tam's research, along with the findings of that Swiss study, and lots of other research too that we probably don't have time to get into, we have a striking commonality which calls for this creation of community. To build this online community, writes Papadopoulos, another Greek researcher, we need to do two things. One, make changes in our course design, and two, include collaborative learning activities. Some of these I will discuss in the next parts. Next slide, please. Further research was carried out by Mariam Asudar and her colleagues. They did a study in 2014 entitled Examining Effectiveness of Communities of Practice in Online English for Academic Purposes, Assessment in Virtual Classes. As you can see, it's very focused on our particular topic of EAP and virtual learning. Next slide. So we'll just summarize some of what she said. Asudar and her colleagues conducted studies that showed significant differences in perceiving the students with a low sense of community and those with a high sense of community. They promote the assessment of students' work based on what we would normally call group work, where students collaborate in pairs or threes or fours. Next slide. And then hit it again. So there's some other stuff. Yeah, there you go. In their study, Asudar and her team asked students to, quote, use their blogs to publish their own work, discuss group assignments, peer review each other's work, collaborate on projects, and manage their digital portfolios. Their study found that blog writing in online teaching of EAP was an effective means to make students feel involved, excuse me, in a class and in a community. I need more water, sorry. In a community where they cannot see each other and they're all at home sitting behind their computers alone. The study identified a number of blog-related tasks that support the development of learning communities as a proxy for a face-to-face language classroom. This approach satisfies the social and cultural aspects of learning and teaching, resulting in the gradual building of a community. The study also found that in terms of EAP, it has direct value for the development of academic writing. How? Why? Well, according to that study, students identified that the internet was a key source of information, and they loved to sort of position their writing and their work, their compositions and so on in the World Wide Web, the wider internet as part of a community, and they can make use of the resources that offers. They also found that teachers' commentaries and personal guidance is a good way of establishing rapport, enabling students to develop and complete the tasks successfully. The next slide. Asudar and her team also discovered that blogging contributes to perceived learning, which means a student's self-report of what they've learned, generally based on some sense of reflection or introspection, asking them what they think they've learned so far in the course. Asudar's team cites assessment as an important factor, perhaps a key motivator in moving students to engage with blogging. Their research, however, showed that the majority of students would be more inclined to blog if the instructor made it a requirement. Some studies showed that the more collaborative the students were in the blogging process, the higher were their levels of perceived learning. Asudar and colleagues also determined that the community students are forming through blogging, quote, triggers perceptions of acceptance, care, and respect. Next slide. So to summarize that, Asudar and her team's research confirmed the effectiveness of blogs in e-learning. The blog-based activities for English language learning were very simple, just reading blogs and leaving comments. And if you are the receiver of the comments, you read them, reflect on the comments from your peers and from the instructors. Not rocket science. What encouraged students to continue making entries on the blogs was that their blogs were credit bearing. Maybe they had some value in their end mark. And that the constant blogging comments of others in the community created threads and connections, a sense of having a voice, belonging to a group. Other studies support Asudar's findings, suggesting that creation of community through peer input can help second language learners improve their writing. This was shown by the fact that students who received the peer feedback on their blog posts were able to get higher scores on their final drafts than those who did not participate, which I thought was kind of interesting. Okay, move ahead, please. So to close this a bit on blogs, the findings of this study reveal that the use of blogs in small learning communities supports the emergence of community by affording students opportunities to socialize, interact, enter into dialogue, seek support and assistance, and express feelings and emotions. This in turn helped them to bridge or prevent feelings of isolation. In other words, blogs can help create the sense of community needed to quell isolation. Creating these communities can help students learn by granting them the chance to co-construct knowledge through participation. The final point of a Sudar and her colleagues' study is that collaboration works. Now, we move on to the next second method of creating community, and that is called near peers, a term which I really had not heard before. So titled Motivational Aspects of Using Near Peers as Role Models, Christine Muir describes near peers as, quote, role models who are people comparable to ourselves in one or more fundamental ways: our age, our gender, ethnicity, past experience. We relate to them on a personal level, and as such, they appear to have a far greater impact on our motivation than someone who is very different from ourselves. Near-peer role models allow us to imagine, if they can do it, why can't I do it? With a near-peer, non-native speakers, that includes teachers and students, so non-native English-speaking teachers can act as examples of people who were successful in their endeavors to learn the new language, and they can show language learning in its many kind of incremental stages. So Muir uses the acronym NPRM for near-peer role model. Next slide. So as a kind of example, she cites this case, a community of learning created by two students named Yuki and Iris. They successfully established new learning relationships, drawing upon their respective strengths and interchangeably playing the roles of expert and novice. Their individual areas of expertise were complementary, and it was this that made their collaboration successful. That is, the students in this classroom were able to view their peers as NPRMs and act as NPRMs for their peers simultaneously as they changed from task to task. With this in mind, we might imagine a learner with a whole class full of near-peer role models, each one respected for a different reason. Next slide. So going back a little bit to earlier research, a peer-to-peer type research by Meryl Swain and colleagues in 2003, probably one of the main benefits of near-peer learning, the learning dynamic, is that, quote, learners can learn from each other during communicative interaction. They found that, quote, of particular significance in the language learning process is collaborative dialogue, or that which occurs when learners encounter linguistic problems and attempt to solve them by running to the teacher? No, by solving them together. We conclude that peer-to-peer collaborative dialogue mediates second language learning. So, next slide. So Muir goes on to discuss some other benefits of NPRMs, and these are students acting as NPRMs can benefit themselves. So kind of like if you acquire some new skill in a language, and somebody just below you, not quite as evolved as you can sort of turn around and share it with them, and that really solidifies that. It sort of makes it a real thing that you own. So assisting others is a real great way to learn. NPRMs can act as models for positive learning habits. Not only can they model successful language use, but they might also model positive communication strategies or other learning strategies and habits. NPRMs can provide feedback teachers are not able to. Maybe the teacher is busy, has too many students to give regular detailed feedback. So given these recommendations, we can see that there's a sort of sense of departure from the native speaker-centric view of language learning. With a near peer, non-native speakers, both teachers and students, can act as examples of people who are successful in learning new skills. They can show language learning in its stages instead of positioning the second language native-like mastery as the only goal. Next slide. So the question comes up then, how can we use this research to help us in the language classroom? Muir again writes, quote, in group activities, for example, we might pair students with different strengths and weaknesses who can help and balance each other. In this way, we can combine near-peer language models, that is, those with stronger language skills, with near-peer effective learners, that is, those with positive learning habits. So in stressful contexts, near peers can offer each other support and reassurance. Developing this kind of dynamic in the classroom is valuable. It can lead students into greater participation in a community of learning and down a path of which they have greater awareness and control. Ultimately, according to the psychology of learning, NPRMs are a powerful device for the pursuit of the ideal L2 future self, where the learner can sort of imagine themselves in the future when they've kind of mastered the language. Yeah. So next slide, please. How am I doing for time? Am I okay? Getting near the end. Okay. Slide 48 here. Muir writes that whatever results near-peer research yields, the evidence that we have so far suggests that setting up NPRMs is well worth the effort. She cites another early researcher, Tim Murphy, who says structuring classroom experiences to enhance near-peer role modeling may be one of the most powerful ways teachers can enhance learning. That was from 1998, quite a ways ago. So next slide, please. In my personal experience, okay, so now theory is past and now we're looking at what actually happens in the classroom. So here, my personal experience is based just on, anecdotal experience, things that have happened to me from a participatory viewpoint. Here are some things I've learned, and some solutions have worked for me, and also I'm going to talk about two problems that I've had with this virtual learning. So I find it's very, very good to send students lesson materials immediately after the class. So if you've done a PowerPoint or some worksheets or something, send them to them right away so they can review. And they should keep them in a folder on their desktop to keep order in their like an archive of their lessons. Encourage email exchange with students, answer immediately. If they write to you in their evaluations of my classes, many of the students said that they appreciated my immediate response. So I get back to them, within an hour if I could. Now we're not going out, right? We're not running around. So the computers are always there in front of us. Have individual consultations with students to establish personal connections. Very important. Do a bit of small talk, discuss their work, give verbal feedback. It's their chance to ask questions and so on. Especially before a big paper is due or something like that, they might need that your advice in those times. Write personal notes in your feedback, and whenever you share a class on Zoom or whatever, what I do is I say, okay, I'm here at my house, the dog is doing this, and outside the window it's raining or lots of traffic or whatever the situation, to kind of give a bit of a, break the ice a little bit. Use their names often. Use their names as often as you can, and ask individual students to read a passage or to read the instruction of an exercise out loud and so on. Acknowledge each student if you can. Now I'm going to skip down to this DJ syndrome. So one thing I've encountered sometimes is that if I'm teaching on Zoom or something, and I look at the class, I don't make any rule about the camera. So all I see is like all these black squares and muted microphones. So I have no idea what's there or what's not there. Maybe 3 or 4 of them are camera on, mute, and unmuted. And so I almost feel like I'm doing a radio show, just talking into the air, not really knowing who's there, who's listening, or whatever. So I'm working on that. And I think establishing some norms of engagement will help me to be able to manage that better. And yeah, breakout rooms was also a bit of a problem because the computer would automatically assign them groups of 3 or 4, for example, but maybe they didn't want to participate. So there would just be 1 or 2 people there instead of the full assigned group. Okay, next slide. In a graphic form, a final takeaway summary might look like this. In this presentation, I tried to develop this thread of how e-learning is upon us and offered a few ideas from the literature how we might improve our online classes. We've looked at the problem of student isolation in particular, and then the solution of creating the sense of community. According to research, it would seem that blogging and NPRMs are effective ways of creating that community. Admittedly, there are many, many aspects yet to be discussed. Given the shortage of time and the scope of this, I've only been able to cover a few points. But teachers can design, like what Jim was talking about, action research. They can do their own action research on a small scale in their own classrooms and on how to build a community of practice. So nowadays, with the pandemic, it's not so much a matter of choice or preference, but of necessity that we embrace, or at least accept, teaching and learning online. It's not going away. So having gone full circle from early innovations like writing and printing to our current practice in the evolution of education, one thing we can be sure of is that as we try to improve our methods in this current teaching dynamic, newer technologies are probably already being developed in some obscure workshop in Cupertino or Silicon Valley. Our only recourse with technology, it seems, as both teachers and students, is to be open, welcome innovations within our profession, not as naysayers like Thamos, but as who we are now, educators embracing a new vision of what the classroom at the threshold of this 21st century. I yield the floor. Oh, and if anyone's interested in the references, the last slide has got them all.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Joseph, and my apologies for the inconvenience caused with the share button. I think we managed to. Thank you very much. Okay, let me just check if anyone has any questions that they'd like to send to Joe. You can put them in the Q&A. Let me see what's there. Okay, we just have some comments thanking you for the presentation. Yeah, you mentioned some great things about blogging and near-peer role models. And at the DI, we're mainly using Moodle for supporting our lessons. And with regard to blogging, I'm thinking there's the discussions function in Moodle that we could use, but I'm wondering, is there anything else that you recommend for the blogging? Any websites that are specifically designed for this?
I guess like Google Docs is a good one too, where everybody can contribute to that. Yeah, that works too. So this for me, like all of this kind of stuff is still very experimental. And as I discovered, there's not much research in online teaching and learning at the moment. So I think the profession is starting to build up a library of articles and such on this. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, Google Docs is definitely a good one. And I think Microsoft Word as well. You can comment on these Yeah.
Of course.
Okay, I think we've definitely gone over time there, so I'll pass it back to Dr. Alla for our closing remarks.
Thank you. Well, I know we're about 10 minutes past the allocated time, but I would still really like to take a couple of minutes just to use this opportunity to reflect on some ideas in the presentations that appealed to me. There were lots of great ideas there, both in terms of suggestions, things to do, how to go about resolving and facing problems in a practical way, linking those to the underpinnings in theory. Lots of great ideas. But I have here, for example, a comment from Kelly Wilson's presentation about really how important it is to create that safe space and that sense of community to foster learning in really a productive way. And I just find that really appealing and probably something that I could use starting tomorrow to improve my teaching. So thank you, Kelly, for that wonderful presentation that was really grounded to the actual practice as we try to move it from the, completely in person to the at least hybrid model, and if not for a while, the completely remotely model. So thank you again very much, Kelly, for this presentation. Now, having listened to the presentation of Jim Buckingham, I felt a bit some regrets that when I was out there trying to market my skills, nobody really advised me that I could repackage them to those prospective employers so I can get a better deal. It's probably a bit too late for me now, Jim, but it's certainly something to consider. But certainly, a presentation that really makes that excellent connection between the job market, which is a reality, and the kind of training and skills we're trying to build or enable our students to possess by the time to graduate. This is no less the case in graduate school than it is in undergraduate work. I think it's applicable to both, and probably even more so at the graduate level. So thank you again very much, Jim. I will work with my colleagues on the possibility of creating our own batch somewhere there. So thank you again. Now, finally, our colleague Joe, who is no stranger to the DI and who has been through thick and thin with us for 2 years, mostly, of course. Thank you very much for that journey, Joe. You took us through, those possible scenarios and different excuses to resist change. And I must confess that some of them do appeal to me even now. Especially when I've, spent or put in, 12 hours to prepare a 2-hour lesson. I feel at the end of those 12 hours that I would like to resist change. So of course, that's a practical consideration, which is, the time requirement on us as educators to make these accommodations to the changing requirements of technology and the changing conditions of education in general. But thank you very much also for walking us through that very clear elaboration of what the problems look like and what possible solutions look like, and then for taking the time to share with us your personal experience as to how we can put all these together to make us communicate more efficiently with the students and also to share with them those learning experiences in a positive format. So thank you very much, Joe, for this journey. And finally, with this panel, and thanks to the generous participation from all the people who attended for the past 3 hours, some of the very thoughtful comments that I've seen in the chat rooms, you made this possible. We look at, my colleagues and I look at this opportunity as a first step to starting and hopefully maintaining contact and a dialogue about the issues that are important to all of us in this field. So thank you again very, very much for your very generous contribution by being with us today. And I certainly look forward to staying in touch and receiving invitations from you about seminars you may host and events that we can attend to. Now it's much easier to be there virtually, of course. I can't promise to be up there at 3 o'clock in the morning, like our colleague Joe Alvaro did this morning, but we can certainly hope to participate wherever we are. And finally, Joe referred to the issue of isolation, and I feel that we all, after panels like this, do not feel isolated anymore. We are all in this together, and I certainly look forward to other opportunities where we can all share and learn from each other. And thank you very, very much, all of you. And of course, last but not least, I would like to thank my colleagues, Richard Baltos, Laila Khurami, and Iman Khalid, for the superb organization of this panel from A to Z. They've worked very, very hard on getting it done. And well, here we are, and I'm glad that we can all see the fruit of this labor. So thank you all very, very much. Okay, and I give it back to Richard now, the big boss.
Thank you, Dr. Al, and again, thank you to our speakers today. We really appreciate your time and effort. And I think, Joe, it's time for you to go to bed. You've been up all night.
My day's just getting started now.
Yeah, and thank you for soldiering through with the presentation, even though there were those technical issues. Layla as well, thank you for advancing those slides for us. And apologies to the audience for that technical issue. I think I'm experiencing a screen fatigue right about now. It's been 3.5 hours plus my classes this morning. So I'm sure our audience is the same. So I think this would be a good opportunity to end. And unless there's any other issues the panel wanted to bring up before we end our presentation today.
No, just
okay.
Thank you so much. It was a fantastic.
Oh, thanks, Kelly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Super event. It was an honor to be here.
Yes.
It was an honor having you. Yeah. Same with you, Joe. And thank you. And I think Jim had to go, but we'll thank him as well for joining us today. And yeah, that's it. I hope you guys have a great evening. And I hope we can take what we've learned here today and apply it in our own classes. I hope all of us can do that. All right.
Yes.
Great. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending, all the attendees, and hopefully we'll see you again very soon.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Richard.
I'm just going to end the event now.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.